Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Okay, so we're going to dig into a little context for our farm and the work we've done. And again, really grateful for the grant, which provided us the opportunity to do this work and to think deeply about it, give us the space and energy to do that. It's not easy to find the time to do that research amidst the busy farming season, but that's where these farmer grants can help support some of that effort. And I encourage you to check out SARE if you're in the US. There's different regions of the organization, and you can apply for these farmer grants if you have a research project. Perhaps you have a tree fodder research project that you want to contribute to this effort. So for us, the definition, the working understanding of silvopasture is something that's alive and is something that's changing all the time. And again, I just want to acknowledge that silvopasture is a very recent word. People have been integrating trees and livestock and grazing systems for millennia all over the world. And when I worked on the book, I dug to try to find some examples, and I know that that was probably less than 1% of the actual examples that are out there. So we've lost a lot of that information, and also that information is embedded in some humans around the world, of course, as well. But it is an ongoing invitation to build a relationship between these elements. And I think the farmer is also, or the grower, the steward, whatever you want to name it, is also a part of that relationship. So we have the livestock, we have the people, we have the trees and the forest, and we have the grazing forages as all elements of this. And of course, we could expand that out and keep talking about it every other piece, because we've seen an increase in bird habitat and the presence of new species of birds since we've engaged with silvopasture. We see an abundance and an increase in soil microbial health and organic matter in the soil as a result of our grazing practices over the last 10 years. So it goes on, and that whole community is really what we're after. And thinking in ways that we shift the language of production agriculture to relationship agriculture is something that's really fundamental. And I think silvopasture and agroforestry give us a lot of invitation to do that. So this definition for us is working, but it frames that silvopasture and what's important to us, our design goals for doing this. We want to engage in ecological restoration of our site, and we want to create habitat for our livestock. And for me, with a background in ecology, it's been really important to shift to thinking about, meeting my animals' nutritional needs, or making sure I have X amount of dry tons per acre for the animals, to thinking about habitat for them, because that shifts for us a lot of the relationship piece to this. Yes, we harvest animals, we eat them, we grapple with that challenging element of the system, but we're maintaining a community. We have a community of sheep and other animals that have filtered through the land, but mainly the sheep, that we're building over time, and they are an extension of the family that is lucky to be on this land and stewarding. Silvopasture generally, there's kind of two directions we can come into the system from. Woodland conversion is taking areas of land that are dominant in woody vegetation and opening up the canopy and bringing light into the understory and cultivating forages underneath. Bringing trees into pasture is sort of the opposite. We're starting with open lands, and we're bringing trees into that space. And so those are almost like two very different approaches. I think that fodder can show up in both of these, and we've been working with fodder in both of these contexts. But I just want to presence that, and a lot of the other introductory material that, if you want to dig more into silvopasture, that we have on our website and others are presenting, gets into some of the nuances of kind of coming at systems from both of these directions and what that means for development. But both, the key thing in here is that we're creating those spaces. We are balancing sort of the light availability. We're making sure that we're cultivating forage, and we're moving animals into those spaces and then moving them out of those spaces and resting them sufficiently so that they can regenerate before we bring that animal impact in. And that's where animals can be a positive force on the landscape, versus what, unfortunately, most of the US we see in sort of what sometimes people think of as woodland animal integration, as sticking animals in the woods and not paying attention to that element of, is there enough food for them? Is there going to be a rest period? Am I going to think about when that critical moment is where I have positive animal impact and it shifts over to something negative because I've left the animals in there for too long? And that's, unfortunately all too common. Some estimates say 15–20% of grazing land in the U.S. is woodland pasture, which often just means a place where animals are sort of put in and not necessarily managed in a way that's good for the woods in the long term. So that is not silvopasture in our mind. We want to see the positive effect of those animals. And all animals, the pig gets picked on a lot, and we love pigs. They have a really important role to play. They just often show up as one of the more destructive forces, and it requires longer rest periods, usually after having pigs in a landscape. But the benefit they can bring is immense. So not to say they're the ones we want to pick on, but our farm vision is really to farm in the image of a forest. We want to steward and take care of the forested lands into the future and think about what that future looks like and support that. And we also want to bring forests back into the open areas of the land that we're blessed to steward. And we would like to think that when we walk off or are buried here, or whatever it looks like at the end of our life cycle, that we've left a forest in our footsteps, not a compacted, degraded, heavily eroded, frankly, sometimes trashed landscape, which is what we found when we came here, literally trash in the hedgerows, right? So what is that legacy? What do we want to leave behind? The forest is continuously our inspiration and something that we are able to draw upon. And our small diversified farm is always changing. We're in a transitional reevaluation, rethinking period, but grazing and mushroom production are foundational pieces that won't go away, as well as the sort of seasonal act of making maple syrup and all that brings. Is important to us, but some of the other enterprises are coming and going. We don't know if duck eggs will be forever in the rotation, but we do a lot, and we are constantly evolving and changing that. And we also have some spaces you can stay on the farm. That's a big piece that's emerged. So if you're ever in the area and you want to check it out, you can check out our website and learn more about the agritourism that we offer as part of it. So on our land, we have access to is somewhat, some we have title to, some we lease. It's kind of typical of a Northeast US farm in the sense of that maybe half woods, half open field, and a lot of edgy hedgerows and areas I'll talk about specifically in relationship to tree fodder. But we have a nice balance of kind of things to work with, but heavily degraded and sort of overdone. And I'd say the forested woody areas have been overly neglected and aren't healthy, mature forests. They're very much in early successional stages, and which is great for this kind of activity that we want to engage with. So lots of space to play and work with here. If you want to get a little more of a sense, if you go to the Silvopasture book website, we have a nice little video tour of our farm and some of the aspects and elements, and you can find that on the Silvopasture book website under resources, or you can find that on the wellspringforestfarm.com website as well. But I want to start with and just share a bit about the tree fodder aspect in particular, which started off with a bunch of sticks that we stuck in the ground. Early on in our farm's evolution, we were very cognizant of both the we're kind of a hilltop farm. We're at the top of the elevation of the area around us, and typically considered non-agricultural. The state forest that's close to us was abandoned by many early colonial colonizer settlers. Many of those folks given this access to that land after the Revolutionary War to start farming, and they abandoned it because it wasn't good farming land and moved on. And so we have this kind of hilly area of heavy clay soils. Not easy for many of the sort of more modern forms of tillage agriculture, but a great place to grow trees once we get kind of working with holistic systems. So water is a major element. Water and wind, there seem to be the major elements that flow through and challenge us on many different aspects on the farm. And so early on, we designed some water harvesting systems that could capture and cycle and move water across the landscape rather than down the landscape, which was clearly eroding things pretty severely. And so we have pretty large swales that harvest and capture, and we've now tested them in several large rain events, and they hold up. In as much as 3 or 4 inch rain events, they hold the water, and that water is not rushing down the hill. It's being held in the landscape and soaking in. But when we first constructed these large swale systems across some of the steeper parts of the land, we wanted to populate them with trees. And for us, it was really just a practical, hey, you know, we don't have a lot of extra resource to put towards trees right now. We didn't have the time or energy or have the setup to do propagation, and looked around us and said, what can we do to get trees growing quickly and inexpensively? And so these are willow stakes that we put in one of our first plantings on the land back in 2013, after the earthworks. And when we move earth, our intention is to never move it again, and to cover it in permanent cover and then put trees in it. And so there is a carbon release and a negative effect in the short term, but we've built a lot of things on top of that, and certainly regenerated quite a bit. And yeah, so this was really just a practical thing of trying to put some trees in the ground, and willow continues to be one of our favorites for many different reasons. This willow just was growing and growing, and 3 or 4 years in, we hit a historic drought on our part of the world. We're kind of in that red blotch there, very severe drought. We were just getting used to grazing, had no sense that we were going to have an issue, and figured, we had the right stocking rate, the right animals, didn't really consider that when a drought comes, the grass doesn't grow. And we're sort of in the pickle that many people find themselves in, where they have hungry animals and not the forage that they'd planned on in their nice drawings and maps they created on the off season. So for us, it was a strategy to look to the places we'd ignored, neglected, hadn't really valued, and think about what are ways we can start to value, integrate, and work with these. And our Katahdin sheep are really a wonderful animal to work with. Their breed is quite willing to browse a wide range of woody vegetation as well as graze, and that combination has really allowed us to use them in a productive way that benefits them, and as well as really works the landscape in a good way. So this is them just working on a hedgerow that we just started fencing off hedgerows and saying, have at it, see what they do. And this was really the first observation that not only were they willing to eat it, which is kind of what we were thinking, but they were excited and eager, and potentially finding new wonderful tastes and flavors and sustenance in these neglected areas where we see blackcaps and goldenrod and wild cherry and willow and buckthorn and honeysuckle and all these kind of things that I was raised as an ecologist to think were bad plants, but the sheep didn't read those books, didn't have to pass those tests, and certainly took to them and intrigued us, to say the least. And at that point in the season, we were looking for anything green to feed our animals, and here's our willow hedgerow. And someone's asking where the willow came from. This was cuttings we actually took from a local plant materials center. The USDA has plant materials centers, sort of repositories and libraries scattered throughout the US. And we have one locally that was willing to offer us some willow, hybrid willow shoots. And this is a purple osier Salix propria willow that we absolutely love, and I'll talk a bit more about. But in this kind of advantageous drought-stricken scenario, we were looking for anything green, and so we decided to give them access to this and sort of see what happens. And felt like at this point the trees were sufficiently large to not have them completely demolished, and sort of the top half of the tree was not going to be touched by these animals, and so gave them some limited access. What we noticed was that they ate it. Yes, they certainly mowed on the vegetation, but they also kind of backed off and slowed down. They didn't go sort of all in the same way that they did with some of the hedgerow species. At that time, we had no idea why that was. We just kind of observed it and left on. Of course, now we learn about things like condensed tannins present in willow in particular, and many other tree species that have some medicinal nutritional benefits to the animals, but also will limit their intake. And so they were hitting a point when they couldn't take on more tannic acid in their system, and so backed off from that. And so our early experience with tree fodder were just sort of opportunistic, but we started to see some of the benefits and realize the potential. Back to that hedge laying conversation, interestingly enough, what we've really started to see, and some of our data is starting to back this up, is that resprout and regeneration of these plants seems to be really beneficial for fodder production. The plants that we have not cut, we have a lot of these willow around the property. Some we have never cut, some we've cut really consistently. The ones that resprout and regrow have a much more sort of much higher vitality, I should say, and the animals notably go after them and eat them and seek them out. And so we really value the animals as indicators of what's going on as much as the data sets that we might collect. And conveniently, when I went over to the UK, I took a hedgeling workshop. I got really excited about it, came back and found some blokes willing to come over. And one was Jim Jones in Canada, and Nigel Adams in the UK came over, and we did a hedgeling workshop just to, again, express the craft, learn about that sort of ancestral knowledge that is hanging on by a bit of a thread. But the fence itself, the hedge that we created out of this willow planting, has now become a more productive tree fodder bank, in addition to being a livestock barrier. Now we don't have to fence this anymore. We can actually use this as the fence and it's the salad bar all at the same time. And so that's where these things start to integrate and get me really excited to think about it. It's not just the growing of the fodder, but also the management. And that's probably the biggest question, is how do we manage these species long-term, specifically so that we can support the needs of livestock, but also the needs of the landscape as we go. And probably our favorite thing about this purple osier willow is the flowering in the spring. That's just absolutely gorgeous, very beautiful, and a welcomed sight as we come out of winter every year. So willow becomes a factor. Tree fodder start to show up in our language and our thinking, and so intentionality. Really, we were using tree fodder, but what is the intention behind this? How do we work with it? How do we dig into it? And this really, for us, was the motivation for Silvopasture as a whole. This was a game changer when we saw our sheep thrive in a drought, and we didn't have to bring in outside forage to sustain them over this drought. We were able to sustain them through that season and out the other end, and really thought, we need to pay attention to this into the future, and not just rely on sort of crossing our fingers and the luck of overgrown vegetation, but really think about how does this fit into our management long term. So for us, tree fodder brings new avenues for nutrition and medicine into our animals' lifestyles. It also provides us especially drought resilience, but also I think flood resilience, because we've seen seasons now with excessive rainfall where pasture can also suffer, where the forages we are relying on to feed our animals are not as reliable. And so what's amazing about trees and forests is, whether it's the wettest year on record or the driest year on record, they're kind of chugging along all the same and providing that abundance and that surplus, as Jonathan mentioned when he was sharing about their project. So I want to chat about tree fodder in general, and then I'll look a little more about some of the things we've been working with on the farm. Before we do that, I want to really mention first and foremost too that these words get tossed around a lot, and they can sort of all mean the same thing or all mean different things depending on who you're talking to. So just keep that in mind as you're looking through literature, reading things, talking to folks. Actually, fodder in and of itself is often an all-encompassing umbrella word for anything you're feeding to animals. And I've seen all these words used interchangeably and in different intentions and different meanings. And some of the material on our website is going to articulate how we're interpreting them. But again, there's a lot of different ways. So what's important is not so much the word or the definition, but I think the understanding behind it. So again, fodder can mean many different things. We tend to use the word tree fodder to focus specifically on woody plants and what they're offering. And what we're thinking about mostly is the leaf material, although we will talk a bit about potentially other parts of the vegetation that can also be a food source, but mainly leaf material. Browse is sometimes used for woody plants that animals are sort of maybe unintentionally finding in the landscape. They're not managed in the same way as a tree fodder might be, but they're browsing on something in the hedgerow, let's say, that just happens to be there. A bit more opportunistic, but I've also seen it used as something more intentional. Forages, again, can really span the gamut of almost anything that the animal might find themselves in, but in my language and my thinking, I'm thinking about the non-woody stuff, the grasses, the legumes, the forbs that we're also utilizing, that actually is the foundation of our grazing system. I don't have any intention to replace forage with tree fodder, but rather have tree fodder as a supplement to a forage-based grazing system. And then mast is really particularly looking at yields that come off the trees that might be edible, like fruits and nuts and things like that. And so often you hear mast being used, and soft mast often being obviously softer things, fruits and things like that, and hard mast being nuts. So just want to presence that and be aware that those things show up. And again, they may not always mean the same things to the same folks. So what we've kind of looked at over time is like, okay, tree fodder is cool, it has some real potential, but what do we need to consider? What do we need to dig in to make this a meaningful element in a greater land stewardship effort? And so one thing is understanding how nutrition changes over the season, because it definitely is not a static number. How we might want to incorporate it as a supplement. Is it a mineral supplement? Is it a basis of a diet? How does it fit into the animal's nutritional needs? And also just the general content and what it looks like for different plants. Are these plants relatively the same? Do they offer different things? What's going on? And that was really the stimulation for this grant we worked on. Something that keeps coming up, and it's always the question, is how we establish trees successfully so that the animals that we're managing, or wild animals in the landscape, aren't killing them. So they're actually getting established, because tree planting is expensive. It takes a lot of time and labor to do it, and we want to see the success of that really enhanced as much as possible. So that's an element I've been specifically digging into lately, and looking at the question of why we so often have these large-scale tree planting projects that don't succeed. Something I'm working on with some of my work through Cornell. Questions around with tree fodder, their tolerance for grazing activity for different species, animals hitting that, and how the plant responds, and their recovery period after that. I can name the number of days, or I can observe in the landscape that if we're grazing grasses and legumes, I can probably bring the animals back in at a certain number of days when they've regenerated, but it's not the same with all the woody plants as well. And we've seen some almost never recover. One tree we tried early on was red alder in the landscape, and the bark itself is something that the animals continue to hit even after 7 or 8 years of the tree getting large. And so they struggle to work with livestock in the landscape long term. So not all trees are necessarily good fits for that. Of course, best species to utilize, we'll talk about that a little more, but which ones are the best bets? Of course, an animal could potentially eat anything, but which ones do we want to focus our energy on and maybe scale up at the landscape scale? How we actually manage these to make a substantial dent in our forage needs is a question. There are fodder systems in the tropics where livestock can work with those 2, even 3 times a year, because the regeneration on those plants is so quickly. But in the cool temperate climate, once a year might be more reasonable, probably, maybe twice, but we don't really know enough about how that looks. And should we be concentrating these efforts? Should we be doing single trees out in the landscape? Should it be some combination of those things? That's a big question. And of course, the piece that comes up a lot is, how do our animals actually engage and are in relationship with these materials, and are they able to regulate so that it doesn't become a toxicity issue? So those are kind of the high level things. And when I was working on the Silvopasture book, instead of listing every single possible species, for me, it was important to just hone in on what the ones that floated to the top a bit. And so we kind of looked at these criteria in the middle of the slide here, and these 4 species really rose to the top as having a really good promise as a starting point. Not that these are the only ones, but that these have a lot of good established research and practice around the world that's being used. And they have several qualities that worked for small farms, I think, in the temperate climate, right? But there's many others to work with, and we looked at some of those in our research as well. So just to show you a couple more things and how we're working with. So I mentioned the willow as an integrated element of the landscape, and we're looking at using willow in the future also as a riparian restoration plant that also provides fodder banks for animals. Black locust has been a big favorite for us. It does well in these harsh soils. We've tried many different planting techniques, but I would say in general, we like to prep the soil as much as we can, get it nice and loose, plant them very densely, and they just take off. And so this is a 2013 planting. 4 years later, the trees were getting on to 30 feet or so, and now we've since thinned this out, harvested some of the material, and left the best of the best in this row to continue to grow on and provide. One caveat I will say with black locust is they fit very well in the silvopasture grazing system, because as they get established, they also love to start suckering. So you can see outside of that row, we now have a lot of sprouts coming up, but the grazing animals really are a good way to manage those. And this is something I'm interested in encouraging in the landscape. I don't recommend this for folks who don't want to manage that or don't want to foresee that as coming into their pasture. So we got to think about that. And locusts and especially any suckering trees, poplar would be another one. We want to think about those edges where we might be planting them and if we're okay with the trees showing up outside of those edges. Because I think that can be an advantage, but if it's unintended or not desired, then it's a problem, right? So this I feel like we're honing in on after 7 or 8 years of really working with this stuff of some systems that are working well for us. And this is the willow on the bottom there from that original planting, and we have the locusts from those pictures up there. And we've been playing a lot with row width. We found that we went way too close. Actually, we started at 30 feet for our sheep. It's way too awkward to graze. We're now moving things out more like 50 or 60 feet. I think with larger ruminants, you'd want to go even further. So I encourage folks to start out really wide and then fill in the space with trees if you want to go there, if you're thinking about grazing. But that can be a really important dynamic to think about. And so for us, this has become a template. It's worked on a small scale on our farm, and now we're thinking about, okay, we're ready to scale up. But we weren't ready to do this 7 years ago. We're really ready at this point to go there and to try this a bit more extensively. So in addition to the things we're planting, we're thinking a lot about the sort of vegetation on the margins, in the edges, and especially the stuff that people love to trash and hate and say are bad elements in the landscape, because I've just loved watching our sheep absolutely get psyched about them and absolutely enjoy them. And then as we dig into nutrition, you're like, oh, wow, there's some really valuable contributions of these plants. And I am not suggesting that we propagate or encourage them to expand their presence in the landscape, but we can use the animals as a way to manage that vegetation while providing some nutrition for them. So maybe eradication should be shifted to just controlled management, controlled harvest of this material, but it's already growing. It didn't cost me anything to plant this, and it provides really sustainable, resilient sources of food, especially in drought times. So we started to play with this on the farm, and one example here is pollarding these buckthorns, which I'll show in some of the data have some really valuable contributions to make, and the animals love them. They stay green really late into the season, and they're very hard to kill, even if you wanted to. So we've been thinking about how to manage them, and this is in one area with adequate light. This is just 1 year's growth from that pollard. And that for us, when I see those in the landscape now, I say, that is our drought forage. It's sitting there, it's waiting. This year was a very wet year. We had ample pasture. So we leave it be, but next time we have a really dry or droughty year, I know that that's there, and that's starting to build that resilience I was talking about, and also be much more manageable than the first time we put the animals in there and had this sort of overwhelming thicket that we couldn't even walk through. So these edges, these margins are really rich places to start to think about, and a lot of that so-called invasive vegetation is found on these edges because it's just where the mower stopped, the farm sort of stopped farming, quote unquote, in the recent history. So these are exciting areas for us to explore, uncover new species that are in there. We found amazing wild apples. We have a friend who's a cider maker, and some of the best cider apples he's found are in these hedgerows that we're freeing up and opening up. And so it's an invitation again to play with the margins and find some of that value. And tree fodder, I think, has a really big role to play in increasing that value. All right, so a few minutes on our work with research, and then we'll take our break and have 15 minutes before we start talking with Lindsay. So what we did basically was collect forage as we would with any, we collected the leaf material as a forage sample, like we could do with hay or silage or anything live in the field, and send it off to the lab. Tried to do it every couple weeks. Had a little bit of a harder time the first year with that consistency, did a little better the second year, but got enough of a sample size, I think, to be able to show what was going on in the landscape. And this afternoon with Ashley, we're going to dig deeper into forage analysis and some of the meanings behind that, and kind of think through a bit about what this could look like on different farms, because I think these results are very site specific and very specific for us. And we're still thinking about what are the implications in a more minute way, other than saying, yeah, tree fodder have value. So what we did is we just sampled randomly in the landscape we identified where some of these species were and took a random sampling. We didn't go to the same plant each time in the way you might do a replicate. What we tried to do is a replicate within the sort of samples as a whole. And the difference there being, we didn't want to focus on one particular species. We wanted to kind of act more as the animal might in the landscape, where they kind of grab a little here, a little there, and we get this kind of average across these different plants. We also literally had to harvest several bags worth of this tree leaf material each time we sampled, and really couldn't keep hitting the same tree time and time again. So that was kind of our experimental design. And for the project, we tried to focus on 3 species that we were actively stewarding, planting, cultivating, the 3 on the top there, and then 3 that were present in the landscape that often get a bad rap, especially in terms of livestock fodder and things like that. So very common. Of course, there's other ones. Autumn olive, I think, has good potential in this context, but we didn't have that actually very abundant in our landscape. But we wanted to kind of look at this as a suite of different options as we went through. And say 2019, we had 2 nice seasons to kind of compare, and we're still kind of digging into some of the potential relationships of this to the data we got. 2019 was relatively cool and wet when we compare it to norms, and 2020 was relatively dry and warmer. So we didn't have a drought, but we had excessively dry conditions starting in June that really persisted through the end of the year until we started to see precipitation in early 2021. And so that definitely informs, and it was interesting to think about. As I mentioned, what I see is the woody vegetation doing just fine, quote unquote, but how does that show up in some of the actual data? So without fully digging in, I'll just show you some of these things. We're doing the interpretation. Again, we're going to dig into this more this afternoon a bit as well, I hope, with time. But just interesting to see, these are some of the sort of meta level values, and we'll talk about ADF and NDF a bit later today. Protein is one that often people start looking at, and it was interesting to see how what a high value of protein is present in black locust and the buckthorn as a result in this. Again, this is an average over the season. We have also the changes throughout the season, which I'll show you in a minute here. When we looked at macronutrients, interestingly, tree fodders in all cases here providing a really notable amount of calcium as a nutrient into the system. And showing up, and also potassium doing quite well and bringing that in as an offering. And so depending on, again, your site and variables, that's something that I think was interesting. When we look at the micronutrients, we see some other things like poplar and willow providing a lot of zinc as into the system, iron being a piece that shows up, things like that. So still digging into a lot of these details, not going to parse out all that right now. You can read a lot of that in the report, but just to kind of show you some of the work we were doing and what we're seeing at the other end. So we're mapping out and looking at the changes over the season as well. Those were averages for the whole season. So here's our change in protein in 2019 and in 2020. And generally the trend, this was a little bit nicer to see because we started earlier in the season. All the species have pretty high protein contents early in the season, which tend to be on the descent throughout the year, some more than others. And then same with nutrients, where we see the dynamics. These are this is the buckthorn and the honeysuckle, and their calcium is particularly notable. And so when are the points of the year potentially when that's highest, or when we might want to capture that as a question, and that we can keep talking about as we go through the day here. And this was 2020. So we definitely have differences from season to season, and it's definitely dynamic and ever changing, and still thinking about the ways this might influence our management. But I'd say overall, we find that tree fodders have something to contribute. Good relative feed value, good high marks on the macro indicators. They all bring something to the table. There's not sort of one that's good and one that's bad. I was pleased to see that honeysuckle and buckthorn certainly offer some real valuable feed. They had good marks on many levels. Protein is definitely something that declines over the season in these results. We see minerals being probably one of the elements that tree fodders can really offer, and that they're abundant in different ways in different species, and they change over the course of the season as a general piece. And there's a lot of likelihood that these results are going to be pretty specific to our context. And so that's what we'll talk about more with Ashley this afternoon, is how we might sample and learn about our own landscapes and the potential there. All right. And I'm gonna leave it on that slide. That's our summary of some of the things that floated to the top. And what I'm gonna do now is stop recording and